podcast with me, your host, your favorite geek psychologist, your favorite pop culture enthusiast, your favorite queen of the nerds, Dr. Vanessa Hintz. And today I'm coming to you all with more supernatural centric content, with another supernatural spotlight, with all the alliteration and conversation about all things Sam and Dean Winchester. The focus of today's conversation will be season 2 of Supernatural, which aired between September 28th of 2006 and May 17th of 2007. Now, as I mentioned before, I am in my first rewatch of Supernatural, and so this go round I'm really attuning to messages, lessons, all of those things. And when I tell you all season 2 has everything, whew. So fun fact, according to a March 2023 article from Collider.com, season 2 of Supernatural is actually ranked the highest by critics with 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. And it is the second highest rated season by audiences with a 93%. The highest rated season, if you're curious, is season 3 with a 94% on Rotten Tomatoes. So season 2 is universally beloved. And so just to provide a brief overview of all the goings on of season 2. So at the end of season 1 in the season finale, we saw Sam, Dean, and their dad, John, in a car crash. And we were left with that sort of cliffhanger, not sure what was going to happen there. And so season 2 actually opens in a hospital where we see Dean, all kinds of bad, and Sam is okay. He's up walking around. John, too, is sort of in the hospital with injuries. And so in the course of this episode, the first episode, whew, it came with it. But Dean is actually, we learned that Dean is actually on life support because the injuries he sustained from the crash were very severe. And so though we see him up walking around and doing all these things, we learn very quickly that he's actually like near death. And so he's kind of in, I think they call it the veil, where people are like between life and death. But nonetheless, he's actually visited by a Reaper because he is indeed dying. And this Reaper has come to sort of take him to the afterlife or whatever Reapers do. And when this is discovered, when both John and Sam learn that Dean is pretty much going to die, they both sort of do their own things to try to save him. Sam actually gets a Ouija board and tries to communicate with him and is successful in doing so. All the while, John has summoned the yellow-eyed demon Azazel, which you all will recall. The yellow-eyed demon Azazel is actually the demon who killed Sam and Dean's mom, and it was the demon that they were all after in the first season that they caught but didn't kill. So here comes Azazel, the beginning of season 2. And John actually makes a deal with Azazel to sacrifice himself so that Dean can live. And so Dean awakens in the hospital. The doctors are like, this is a miracle. Oh my gosh, this is so great. And John knows that he has made this deal and that he is about to go to hell because he's made this deal. And he whispers something in Dean's ear, which we learn later in the season, is that basically Dean needs to watch out for Sam. And if Sam starts to act wild and really goes all to the dark side, then you might have to take him out. Everything I just said, y'all, all of that happened in episode 1. So you already knew this season was about to be on one because everything I just said happened in episode 1. And so the season really revolves around Sam and Dean searching for Azazel because, you know, the yellow-eyed demon always on some mess. He always got something going on. In the course of this season, we're introduced to Ellen and Joe, a mother-daughter duo who run Harvell's Roadhouse. Sam and Dean learn that it's a place where hunters sort of frequent. There's also a colorful character named Ash who is super smart and really provides them with a lot of info. Along the way, during the course of the season, Sam and Dean find other people that are similar to Sam in that they have like special abilities because the demon also visited them when they were young and killed their moms. And so there's like this contingent of specially abled people like Sam. And again, he comes across a few of them. They come across a few of them over their time hunting. They continue hunting, and there are some pretty gnarly episodes in season 2 related to monsters that they face and all kind of stuff. So more to come on that very soon. Dean is experiencing some major survivor's guilt, understanding that his father is dead because he is alive and his father is dead, and he feels like that is somehow his fault. One of his mantras throughout the season is, "What's dead should stay dead," which anyone who has ever seen Supernatural ever knows that is laughable at this point. But, if this is your first go round, that, it's pretty serious, right? What's dead should stay dead. In season 2, we are introduced to some lovable characters that we will see throughout the series, including the Trickster. We also get more of Bobby in season 2 and the infamous Blue Steel mugshot. Dean's Blue Steel mugshot. At the end of season 2, all of these sort of specially abled psychic kids are kidnapped and sent to this real Western-looking town in South Dakota that's isolated, and they're forced into this like Hunger Games situation. It's just like a whole mess. The yellow-eyed demon says, "Yeah, I'm looking for the best of the best of the best. So whoever gets out of here alive, cool. Everybody else is going to get dead." And so Dean and Bobby come and save the day. And they come to rescue Sam from this old Western-looking town. In the midst of Sam and one of the sort of final people that he's battling, who is a man named Jake, who is played by the devilishly handsome Aldous Hodge. So Sam and Jake are sort of in this fight to the death. And Sam is winning, but in the last instance, he decides not to kill Jake because that's what the demon wants. And then he hears Dean and Bobby coming, and so he's like, "Oh, yes, rescued," only to be stabbed in the spine by Jake, and ultimately killed. That was very sad. Even though we know that that's not the end of Sam because there's 15 seasons, it is very difficult to watch. And so Sam is killed in the second to last episode of season 2. And in the last episode of season 2, we see Dean make a deal with a crossroads demon to bring Sam back to life. And in return for Sam coming back to life, Dean is given 1 year to live. And when folks learn that this is what he did, and by folks I mean Bobby and Sam, they're both super pissed. And so nonetheless, there's still a task at hand. They still have to deal with Azazel. So resurrected Sam, Dean, Bobby, and Ellen learn that Azazel is trying to open a gate of hell. And so they sort of go to where this gate is for this like final confrontation. And he actually does open the gate for like, I don't know, 35 seconds, 5 minutes. I don't know. It was very hard to tell. But this gate of hell is open and all these demons are coming out. And while this gate of hell is open, Daddy John Winchester comes strolling out and he actually helps fight Azazel. So in the end, at the end of season 2, Dean shoots the yellow-eyed demon Azazel in the head with Samuel Colt's gun. So he's dead. Their dad has escaped from hell, as have a whole bunch of demons. And so at the end of season 2, we see Sam and Dean preparing to go deal with all these demons that have escaped hell. Dean tells Sam that he only has 1 year to live, and Sam is like, "Well, we're going to do something about that." End scene. See, I told you it was a lot. Whew. And it is absolutely understandable why people love this season so much, because it literally has everything. And so the first thing I want to sort of talk about with regard to lessons from the season is probably the one that's the most obvious, and that is relative to grief and dealing with grief. And so, what I think is unique about season 2 is that not only do we see Sam and Dean attempting to cope with their father's death, but also with their own. Because we see Dean in the very first episode of the season is pretty much dead, dying, and is brought back to life. And then we see Sam at the tail end of the season dead and brought back to life. And so the way that they are navigating their own mortality and their own grieving, I think, is so intense. And so I want to very briefly just highlight again the stages of grief, most notably those developed by Kubler-Ross. And when we talk about the stages of grief, we're talking about learning to live with and or to cope with loss. And so that can be someone who has recently learned of their sort of own impending death, whether that be because of an illness or something like that. So how one manages, relates to, copes with their own mortality, as well as how people cope with the loss of loved ones in their lives. And so 5 stages of grief, not sequential, can happen at any time in any order: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And again, all of those things, exactly what they sound like. The one that I think is the most probably like eyebrow raising is bargaining. And typically, and we see this a little bit in the first episode of season 2 where Dean is talking to Tessa the Reaper. Bargaining is essentially, if I'm spared, I promise to blah, 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 blah. And it's essentially what John did to save Dean's life. And it is exactly what Dean did to save Sam's life. If you spare them, I will. Beautifully, beautifully done. Also infuriating to someone who is a viewer. But again, I think that the way that they navigated grief in this season was absolutely beautiful. It was heavy, heavy, heavy at times. And so I want to talk a little bit about the first few episodes of the season because, again, as I referenced, so much happened in that first episode. So before Dean encounters Tessa, he has like a whole first episode of The Walking Dead situation where he wakes up in a hospital and he is walking around and talking to people, but nobody can hear him. And for me, that is literally like one of my worst nightmares. Like ever since I saw the premiere episode of The Walking Dead where Rick wakes up and he's like walking around and no one is there, that is literally a nightmare of mine. And so the way that it was shot, the way that it was played, amazing. And again, we see Sam and Dean talking to each other through the Ouija board. And one thing that Sam says to Invisible Dean is, there has to be a way to save you. And I would argue that this is both the denial stage as well as bargaining. Because again, Sam will not accept that Dean will die. And that is interesting on an existential level. But I think in addition, when you think about what it is that they do as hunters and the things that they have seen, to me, the inability to accept that death is the end is not as unrealistic, for lack of a better word, not so far out of the question, again, because of the things that they've encountered, which only become more and more interesting as the series progresses. But nonetheless, again, we see John in this initial episode make a deal for Dean, which, all the crying emojis. It was so much. It was so much. And in the context of John bargaining with Azazel, Azazel mentions to John, like, you have to go to hell. Like, you can't just be hanging out here in the Vale. And Azazel says to him, how do you think angry spirits are born? They can't let go. They can't move on. And so essentially, even inherent in this quote, we see the difficulty, the tension, the barriers for people to really accept mortality and accept death and accept loss. And again, I think this first episode, In My Time of Dying, phenomenal acting, by Jensen, by Jared, by Jeffrey Dean Morgan. Like, it was so beautiful. And again, at the end of the episode where John is sort of having his, what we now know to be his final-ish conversation with Dean, he thanks Dean for all that he has done, and he also apologizes to Dean for all the things that he sort of made him do for his parentification, which much, much more to come on that in a few moments. Episode 2 of season 2 is titled Everybody Loves a Clown. And first of all, I don't love clowns. I hate clowns. Thank you, Tim Curry. Pennywise, I don't like clowns either. Sam hates clowns. One thing I loved about episode 2 is that, it took place in Wisconsin. I live in Wisconsin, so it always makes me happy. I'm like that Leonardo DiCaprio meme, like pointing at the TV, like, ah. In episode 2, actually at the end of episode 1, is when the lying starts. The line between these two brothers, like, they just be lying. Like, it's one of those, like, why are you lying? Which, again, more to come on that very soon, because I actually have a theory as to why they're lying. But at the end of episode 1, Sam asked Dean, did Dad say anything to you? And he was straight up like, nope, sure didn't. Negative, sir. He surely did not. And then in episode 2, as they are driving to where the killer clowns are, Sam is asking Dean, like, are you okay? Because you don't seem okay. Like, this is not cool. And Dean just keeps saying, I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. Episode 2 is, again, where we meet Ellen and Joe and Ash for the very first time. And Sam and Dean are trying to reconcile the fact that their dad knew this lady and never mentioned him, even though she knows everything about them. A whole mess. But one of the pervasive themes, I think, of episode 2 is the repression of emotions, which, again, we see throughout this series. But particularly in episode 2, again, Sam is asking Dean, like, it's okay not to be okay. Like, how can I help? How can I help? How can I help? And because of his own situation, because of his own ways of wanting to cope with his feelings, Dean is like, boy, if you don't get away from me. And the closing scene of episode 2, we see Dean just going to town on the trunk of his car with a sledgehammer, and, aggressively acting out his feelings. Now, I'm here to tell you, I don't necessarily think that there's anything wrong with that. I mean, he wasn't swinging that sledgehammer at a person. I know that those rage rooms have become all the rage. You see what I did there? But I know that these rage rooms where people can just take bats, take whatever, and just, like, beat the shit out of stuff, I know that has become popular, and I think there's absolutely a reason for that. There was a study done, I think in the 70s, the Bobo doll experiment, where this study found that if children saw aggressive behavior, they would act it out. And it was sort of like this commentary on, don't let kids watch violent stuff because then they will be violent. And I think that if we channel children's aggression into other things all the time. So I don't think it's about let's not be aggressive. I think it's about teaching folks how to appropriately channel aggression. And so, again, we see Dean aggressively hitting the back of his car with a hammer. He wasn't hitting a person. He wasn't, you know what I'm saying? And so, again, I think that is a continuation of his anger, his depression related to not only losing his father, but also, managing his own, like I said, survivor's guilt. And then the last thing I'll say by way of grief and the processing of grief and loss is related to episode 3, titled Bloodlust, where we are introduced to the phenomenal Sterling K. Brown, who plays Gordon, who is another hunter that they come across, that Sam and Dean come across as they're hunting vampires, I believe. But they meet this guy, and it's like, oh, he's super cool. Like, Dean kind of connects with him right away, as somebody who understands the lifestyle and as somebody who is, like, really in the hunting lifestyle. Because, Sam is always rest to go. You know what I'm saying? So Dean connects with Gordon. In the context of the episode, they actually find out that he is on some other mess. But nonetheless, before all this happens, Gordon says something about grief, and it was a quote that I actually wrote down because I was like, yes. And it's actually a quote that we use, something akin to what I say to people, in therapy when we're talking about grief. And Gordon says, quote, "Grief is a hole inside you that just keeps getting bigger and bigger and darker and darker." Yes. Absolutely, yes. And I think that what makes grief so difficult to process is feeling as if there's nothing you can do about that. So this hole is big, this hole is deep, this hole is dark. And I would argue that acceptance phase and the way that we sort of help people to learn to cope with their grief is by accepting, yes, it is. Allow yourself to feel that, because I think what makes, again, grieving difficult is when we feel this way, but we feel like we shouldn't. And that's what I think we see with Dean and his repression and his inability to acknowledge that he's not okay. He feels like he should be okay, which makes everything even much more unbearable, right? And so Sam says something to Dean in episode 3. He says, quote, "Dean, Dad's dead and he left a hole. You just can't fill that hole with whoever you want to." Yes, come on. Sam was always being a therapist, being a scholar, just being everything. And I feel like Sam don't get enough love. Come on, Sam. Come on, Sam. He was the steady to Dean's like fire. He was like a steady stream, steady river. Anyways, that's neither here nor there. But again, I think part of what, again, I really appreciated about this representation of grief and grieving is, again, to me, it was so, and I hesitate to use the word accurate, but it's like, yes, I felt that. You know what I'm saying? Like it was, yes, I was here for it. And so more to come on grief and loss throughout the entirety of this series, because that's exactly what it is. It's like Game of Thrones up in here. Like, don't like someone because they're probably going to not be around any longer. Nonetheless, the second thing I want to talk about related to season 2 and something that I think was very evident is around this idea of parentification. And so, simply put, parentification is when children, quote, grow up too fast. And so ultimately children are asked to take on adult responsibilities, whether that is caring for themselves, whether that is caring for younger siblings. Sometimes that can even be supporting their parents, whether that be two parents or a single parent, but essentially the child is called upon to provide support in some way, whether that is, again, support by doing chores, by taking care of younger siblings, or they're sort of called upon to support their parent emotionally, whatever. So what happens unintentionally is that parentified children, they become accustomed to devaluing and or ignoring their own feelings and desires and prioritizing their responsibilities and the feelings of others. So we see a good example of this. I believe it was season 1, where we see a flashback sequence where Dean leaves a sleeping Sam so he could go across the way and play video games in the arcade because he is like, I need to get out of here. I've been in this room all this time. And so we then see that in that moment, Sam is like attacked by some sort of creature. I don't remember what creature it was. But in that moment, when John comes home, he's like, Dean, why would you do that? And Dean says, I just had to get out of here. And John says to him, well, you need to look after your brother. And so again, when that happens a whole bunch of times in a child's life, they unconsciously or otherwise learn that what they want, what they need is not important. And so I would argue that also Dean's inability to admit that he is hurting, Dean's inability to admit that he has all this going on internally is a byproduct of his parentification. He has been taught over time. How long has he been hunting with his dad? Since he was 6, he's been taught over time that however you feel, it doesn't matter. We have stuff we got to do. And again, let me just say, I don't think that anybody does this to their child intentionally. I think all of these things happen unintentionally. So regardless of the intention, the impact is very real. I think, again, in season 2, the last episode of season 2, titled All Hell Breaks Loose Part 2. There is so much. First of all, Jensen, you just better come with it with his acting. I feel like the first time around, I didn't appreciate how good the acting is in this show, and maybe it is now because I am all the way obsessed that I'm viewing it with a different lens, and I feel so much more connected to the characters because I'm investing so much. But nonetheless, Jensen's acting in the last episode of season 2, I'm thinking in particular the scene where he was talking to Sam's dead body, and he had this whole monologue, and he's crying, and he's like, he says to him, what am I supposed to do? Without you, like, what am I supposed to do? Like, his entire life was about taking care of Sam, and now Sam is not here. What am I supposed to do? If that don't hit you right in the feels, like, it's even talking about it right now, like, my chest is getting tight. Like, come on. And I think, again, it speaks to their relationship as brothers, but also to Dean, who, his entire everything is about taking care of Sam. And now that that's not here, what do I do with that? Come on with the existential angst, okay? So I believe it was in that moment that Dean knew he was about to go to that crossroads and make that deal with that crossroads demon to bring Sam back to life. So nonetheless, after he brings Sam back, he kind of doesn't tell him, because again, they lying, all this lying. He doesn't tell him. And it's actually, Sam picks up on the context clues of everybody kind of like, why are you alive? And he realizes that, I was probably dead. And so in they're having a conversation about this, Sam is like, why would you do this, Dean? Like, why? What are you doing? And Dean says, and I quote, Dad brought me back. I'm not even supposed to be here. At least now my life can mean something. Y'all, the fact that Dean is a person who has devoted his life to killing things that go bump in the night. Dean has devoted his life to protecting the greater good. He feels like none of that matters if Sam is not okay, which is both beautiful and depressing at the same time, right? Again, existential angst. Existential angst. At the end of the episode, after, they win the day, and Sam he asked Dean, he said, how long do you have? Like, how long? What are we talking about? And Dean says, like, 1 year. And Sam is like, bro, what? Like, come on. And Sam starts talking about how, like, all right, we're going to figure this out, blah, da, 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 da. And Dean says to him, and I quote, I had to look out for you. That's my job. And so, again, this parentification is serious. Dean is about to lay down his life so that his brother can live. And again, I'm not saying that's good, bad, or whatever. I'm not telling him not to be a martyr. I'm not telling him not to do that. What I want to point out is that I absolutely think this is because of his parentification, because over the course of his life, even the first scene in the series Supernatural where we see Mary's death, we see John pick up baby Sam, hand him to Dean, and say, John says, take your brother outside, Dean, now. Don't look back. From that moment, I feel like that was what Dean's life was about. And so, again, more and more to come on that throughout the context of the series. The last thing I want to sort of reference with regard to two other things, actually, that I want to reference with regard to season 2, and I've sort of alluded to it, is this lying, okay? That we know, those of us who have been through this series one or more times know, them Winchesters stay lying to each other. Like, seriously, I just want to shake them. Like, sometimes I'm like, why you stop that line? But what I will say in terms of why I think they're lying and the sort of what it serves, because as a psychologist, as a therapist, when we're presented with a child or whoever that is lying, the first thing that we want to understand is, like, what need does that fill for you? Like, what does that serve? What does your lying serve? Because there are, diagnosable disorders where people lie with no apparent gain. In most instances, when people lie, it does something for them. Like, there is a reason that they're doing that. It serves a purpose. And I would say for the Winchesters, lying serves the purpose of avoidance. when you lie, you can avoid what's really going on inside. I often say when you do, you don't have to feel. So when you're lying and doing all this stuff, and we even see Dean throughout the context of this season when he's hunting and he's like, I gotta do something, I gotta do something, or he's just like randomly stabbing people, like whatever. He's doing stuff so he doesn't have to feel. And again, to me, that is not inherently a bad thing. It is not inherently a bad thing to distract yourself so that you don't have to feel. When you make it the norm rather than the exception, that's when problems can arise, because when you repress your feelings and emotions, I used to say this to my clients, it's like water backing up in a pipe. You can push it down for so long, eventually it's going to erupt, essentially. You know what I'm saying? And so there was an episode of season 2, episode 4 actually, titled Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things. And the context of this episode was that there was some necromancing going on. This woman was brought back to life by her friend who was in love with her, and it was just like a whole situation. And so, again, thinking about how so much of this early season is focused on grief and mortality and all of these things. And again, we hear Dean more than once say, quote, when someone is gone, they should stay gone. And I would argue that, again, this sort of taking this firm stance, taking this hard line for Dean, like, no, if they're dead, they're dead. This is absolutely rooted in his survivor's guilt. This is his way of avoiding the complexity of all of that, right? Like, of avoiding really having to face, manage, talk through, cope with whatever, all of that guilt that he feels in that he is alive and his dad is not. And so more to come on this lying throughout the course of the series, because you know that they stay lying. Every time something happens, it's like, which one of them gonna lie? Because they be lying. And so more to come on that. The absolute last thing that I'll say that I appreciated about season 2 is that we start to see what I think is one of the most amazing things about Supernatural as a series, is the way that we are navigating the complexities of morality. And so returning to episode 3, Bloodlust, where the Winchesters team up with Sterling K. Brown, aka Gordon, and they are hunting these vampires, right? And Gordon says something that I think is, again, indicative of what I think this show doesn't do. And he says, quote, this job is black and white. There are no shades of gray. And that is what we call dichotomous thinking, either or thinking. So there's good and there's bad, there's up and there's down, there's nothing in between. That is an easy way to be and an easy way to think. What I appreciate, and again, what is so beautiful about the way that they did this episode, is that even the context of the hunting in this episode challenged that, right? So they end up hunting vampires who they think are killing like people, when actually it turns out these vampires live on animal blood, because they say, and what I don't remember her name, but the vampire lady that they sort of are confronting at the end, she says, quote, we just want to live. We're not hurting anybody. And this, I think, is one of the first times of many that we see throughout the series where the people or the monsters that you expect to be horrendous and terrible are actually not. I think Crowley is an amazing example of this, to be continued. But I think that this is one of our first sort of, quote, shades of gray monster stories. And again, I think throughout the context of the series, particularly with the entrance of the angels and demons and all of this and how everybody sort of is acting, it's amazing. The way that the show navigates ideas of good and evil, right and wrong, moral, just, what have you. So with that, we have come, my dear friends, to our about that moment, subject, Supernatural Season 2. And so the way I'm going to break this down is, again, because it's very hard for me to say negative things about Supernatural, which whatever, I'm going to own it. I'm going to uplift that I have a problem, okay? I am blinded by the smiles and the pecs and everything, whatever, okay? But the way that I want to break this down is by talking about my favorite episode, my least favorite episode, and some just overall notes about the season. And so I actually have two favorite episodes of season 2, and both for very different reasons. So one is episode 12, titled The Night Shifter. This also took place in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is where I live. And so that was pretty awesome. Just to see that, I was like, even though that was absolutely a fake downtown Milwaukee, but whatever. So the context of episode 12 is that Dean and Sam are in Milwaukee investigating this series of what they believe to be supernatural deaths. And essentially they come across this guy named Ronald, who they are questioning in there as fake FBI agents about something. And Ronald, who is a bit eccentric, is how I'll describe him. Ronald has done his own sort of investigation and has sort of uncovered what he believes to be the thing that they are hunting, which Ronald refers to as a mandroid. And we come to understand is actually a shapeshifter. And so Ronald in this episode is played by Chris Gauthier or Gauthier. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but chef's kiss to that man, because that was amazing. His portrayal, I mean, you felt it. He was like it was almost like a tragic hero type of situation. Like, it was beautiful because essentially in the course of the episode, like, he is essentially right about everything that he says, even though he is shunned, people call him crazy, all these things, but he's essentially right about, even though it's not a mandroid, but he's right about what it is that they're hunting. And it actually produces a conversation between Sam and Dean that I think is interesting, where Sam is saying like, yo, we need to just tell this man the truth. And Dean is like, no, so that then he can have this same weight that we have, that we know that there's all this kind of, scary stuff that's, haunting, whatever. So that tension I think was amazing. The acting throughout that episode was fabulous. There was so much that was going on. There were so many different pieces, because once again, Sam and Dean are at the center of something that could get them locked up. And the last thing I'll say about episode 12, it probably had one of, if not the best exits of a supernatural episode ever, because essentially to escape this bank, that is now surrounded by FBI and SWAT and all of this, Sam and Dean actually beat up some SWAT people and take their uniforms, and they're like running away. They approach the Impala in these SWAT uniforms. It's just so beautiful. It was so beautiful. They look so cute in their little outfits. Like, I loved everything about it. So my other favorite episode from this season is actually episode 15, entitled Tall Tales. And the reason is because, again, we're introduced to the trickster for the first time, whom will be back many a times throughout the course of the series. But the other thing is that it was absolutely so relatable. Sam and Dean are up here getting on each other's last nerve, and they have called Bobby in to sort of help them navigate this tension, but also because this case that they're working on doesn't make any type of sense. And so throughout the course of the episode, we see the brothers basically describing how they view the other one. And so Sam is recounting his series of events and, the way that he portrays Dean versus the way that, Dean tells his story of events and how he portrays Sam. I mean, it is hilarious. We get in this episode the ever famous picture of Dean where he has all that candy in his mouth. And just the way that Dean sort of contextualized Sam as being really emotional, like, you brave little soldier. It was so hilarious. And it was so relatable. Anybody who has a sibling, a cousin, anybody that you're in close quarters with for a long time, that you can get to that point. And we see them like wrestling each other. It's just so relatable. So favorite episodes, episode 12 and episode 15. My least favorite is actually episode 20. And I'm going to tell you why it was my least favorite. It's not because I don't think it was well done, because I think it was beautifully done, which is actually the reason that I don't like it. And so episode 20, titled What Is and What Should Never Be. The brothers Winchester are hunting a djinn, which is essentially like a genie, someone that grants wishes, whatever. And in the context of Dean sort of investigating this, while they're trying to, lay low and not get arrested, because they're on like the FBI's most wanted list. Dean goes to this abandoned warehouse to try to look for the djinn, and he actually gets captured, for lack of a better word, by this djinn, and he's actually put into an alternate world, essentially. And so I think that he kind of slowly but surely begins to understand that that's what's happening. But in the context of this alternate world, his mother never died, and so his mother is alive. Jessica never died, so Sam and Jessica are together. Dean has like a girlfriend. He's not a hunter, because for Dean, the djinn sort of grants his wish, which is not that he uttered aloud, but just sort of that the djinn very voyeuristically got from his mind, is that he wishes that his mom never died. And Dean has also made reference throughout season 2 that he wishes that they didn't have to do this job, that they could just be normal. And so in this perfect world, quote unquote, Sam and Dean actually don't have a relationship. They're very different, and there's nothing that they have in common. When confronted by this, and Sam says that to Dean, he said, we don't have anything in common. And Dean says, well, we have hunting. And Sam is like, what? So in this world, not only, again, is there no hunting, but Sam and Dean have no type of relationship. It's even alluded to that Dean has a problem with drinking, and he just can't keep his life together, like all this stuff. And so this was just a very emotionally exhausting episode. Again, the existential angst was on 400. It was at the end of the episode when Dean sort of figures everything out, that he's in this world and he's trying to wake himself up. He's confronted with, all these people in this fake world, his mom, Sam, Jessica, his fake girlfriend, like all these people. And they basically say, like, yeah, this is fake, but you're happy, so you could stay here. Like, yes, eventually you'll die, but you'll live a full life. And one of the quotes that I don't remember who says it to Dean, but they say, you'll get to watch Sam live a full life. And in the context of this sort of confrontation between all these fake people and Dean in this dream world, he says, why do we have to sacrifice everything? Why, why can't this be? Why do I have to sacrifice everything? And again, that hit me right in my soul, because again, this is like an existential crisis. And so this was an amazing episode. I don't like it because it's too much in the feelings. And again, when I say I don't like it, that's me avoiding. That's me absolutely doing what I just said that Sam and Dean do, which is me avoiding my feelings. Because again, season 2 was heavy. And this to me was one of the heavier episodes. And so overall, what I would say about season 2, I absolutely loved all the references to horror related things, and there were so many. Again, every time I saw one, I wrote it down. So we had the episode where they were hunting the ghosts of H.H. Holmes, which is like, yo, what? Linda Blair was in an episode. They made a reference to The Exorcist, obviously, in that episode. They made references to so many classic horror movies: Pet Sematary, Silence of the Lambs, The Shining, I Know What You Did Last Summer. There was a scene, I think it was episode 17, where the context of the episode was Sam and Dean. Basically, there were these two ghosts that were haunting this highway, and they were trying to, they only haunted it once a year, and they were trying to, deal with that, whatever. But there's a scene in that episode where a girl is grabbed through the window, and I was like, yo, that is absolutely a scene from Friday the 13th Part 2. And me and my little horror nerd heart, I was here for it. In addition, episode 18, titled Hollywood Babylon, Sam and Dean are actually on the set of a scary movie investigating like a haunting. And I love everything about it because this is one of the many instances where we see them making fun of themselves, essentially. Like at the beginning of the episode, they're sort of taking a tour of this Hollywood studio, and you hear the tour guide say, now we're coming up to the setting of the show Gilmore Girls. And you see Sam sort of make this face, and he's like, we gotta go. And he runs away, which is funny because Jared Padalecki was on Gilmore Girls. And then we also see these sort of creators of this horror movie really just poking fun at all the things that we see in Supernatural. For example, if ghosts are in hell, how do they hear chanting? These rules don't really track. Why would a ghost be afraid of salt? And so all of these different things, which again, I think is something that Supernatural does so well, which is to not only break the fourth wall, but also just make fun of themselves in a way that make us feel really connected to the show, to the characters, etc. And the last thing I'll say that I appreciated about this season was sort of a lot of the foreshadowing that we saw, particularly with the discussion of angels. So episode 13, Houses of the Holy, Sam and Dean are hunting something that Sam thinks is an angel, and Dean is like, it's not, because angels are not real. And Sam is kind of like, of all the stuff we've seen, like, why wouldn't angels be real? And Dean just refuses. And it turns out it's absolutely not an angel, it's just a ghost. But it's interesting because we know how integral angels will be to the series, season 4 and beyond. So I think as a return watcher, that was really cool to sort of to hear all that foreshadowing. And then, as I mentioned, like, this season, the existential angst was just off the chain. And I think, season 1 there was angst, but it was different in season 2, like this. Because again, this is the first time that we see Sam and Dean really confronted with death or like dying in some kind of way. And we know that from here on out, spoiler alert, that happens once a season, if not more. And so that, again, I think is the way that this show navigates, again, existential angst, morality, death, all of these things, I think is so amazing, and is probably part of the reason that the show called out to me so much, and why I love it so much is because I'm an existential phenomenologist. That is my way. That is my way of thinking. That is my way of working. And I feel like this show really speaks to me on that level. And with that, I want to thank you all for your time, for your attention. And I'm very excited to continue this rewatch journey with you all. Until next time, I wish you and your families safety, health, and joy. Carry on, my good people.